This video thoroughly covers everything in Unit 4 of AP Human Geography in just 43 minutes. It's part of my full 5-hour course review, which you can also find on this channel. You'll occasionally see mentions of the 5-hour study guide and FRQ Mastery Playbook. Both are designed to be completed while watching these videos, and they're linked in the description if you want to get exam ready in just 5 hours. Otherwise, enjoy the video. Unit 4 in AP Human Geography is titled Political Patterns and Processes. It's all about how politics influences how people use and interact with the land. The unit contains 10 lessons. Let's dive right in with Lesson 1. In this lesson, you need to learn about 7 types of political entities. These are independent states, nations, nation-states, stateless nations, multinational states, multi-state nations, and autonomous and semi-autonomous regions. An independent state is a clearly defined area with a permanent population, recognized borders, and a government that has full control over its internal and foreign affairs. These states are the building blocks of the political world, and nearly every part of the globe today is part of some state. The modern world political map is made up of almost 200 independent states. Nations are groups of people who share a common culture, language, history, or sense of belonging, even if they do not control their own government. For example, the Kurdish people in the Middle East are considered a nation because they share culture and identity, even though they live across several countries. The concept of a nation, and in particular that a nation is not a state, is very important to understand for this lesson. To reiterate, a nation is not a state. It's a group of people with shared culture and identity. With that said, let's look at the other concepts that the AP Human Geography curriculum requires you know for this lesson. The next is nation-states. These are countries where most people belong to the same nation. In other words, the borders of the country match the identity of the people. Japan is a good example because most people there share the same culture, language, and history, making it both a nation and a state. Stateless nations are groups of people who consider themselves a nation, but do not have their own independent country. For example, the Palestinians see themselves as a nation, but they do not have a fully recognized state of their own. Multinational states are countries that include more than one nation within their borders. The United Kingdom is an example since it has the nations of England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland within the borders of the state. Multi-state nations are nations that are spread across the borders of more than one country. For instance, Koreans are divided between North Korea and South Korea, but they still see themselves as one nation. Autonomous and semi-autonomous regions are areas within a country that have some degree of self-rule or independence. For example, American Indian reservations in the United States are semi-autonomous regions because native nations have their own governments and laws in certain areas, even though they are still part of the larger country. The semi-autonomous example of American Indian reservations is specifically named in the AP Human Geography curriculum, so don't be surprised if it appears in the multiple choice questions in the exam. That brings us to the end of Topic 4.1. If you're following along with the study guide, check your answers for this section using the answer key before moving on. If you're using the FRQ Mastery Playbook, complete this lesson's exam-style free response practice questions and check your answers. And when you're ready, we'll move on to Topic 4.2. In this lesson, we will explore the political processes that shape the world. First, we will define 3 key concepts that influence how the world is divided today: sovereignty, nation-states, and self-determination. Then, we will examine 4 political practices that have shaped political boundaries: colonialism, imperialism, independence movements, and devolution. Let's start with our key concepts. Sovereignty is the idea that a state has full control over its own territory and government. A sovereign state can make its own laws, control its borders, and conduct foreign policy without interference from other states. This is the basic principle that allows countries to function independently. For example, France is a sovereign state. It controls its own affairs and is recognized by other nations as having the right to do so. A nation-state is a state where the boundaries of the nation and the state match closely, meaning the people share a common identity, language, or culture, and they have their own country. We've already discussed these in the previous section, so you should have a good understanding of these already. Self-determination is the belief that nations have the right to form their own states and control their own political future. This idea became especially powerful in the 20th century, as colonized peoples fought for independence and as minority groups began seeking autonomy. For example, the breakup of Yugoslavia was driven by ethnic groups seeking self-determination to form their own independent states, such as Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Together, these ideas shape how countries are formed and how groups within countries push for control over their own political lives. Now let's look at the 4 political practices that shape political boundaries. We've already touched on colonialism and imperialism in previous units, but I'll briefly go over them again because the AP Human Geography curriculum explicitly requires that we cover them in this lesson as well. Colonialism is the practice of one country settling in and taking control of another territory, usually for economic and strategic gain. During the 1500s to 1900s, European powers colonized much of Africa, Asia, and the Americas. These powers often drew political boundaries without regard to local cultures, creating lasting problems. For example, many of Africa's modern borders were created during European colonization and still cut across ethnic and linguistic groups. Imperialism is broader than colonialism. It involves one country dominating another politically or economically, even without full settlement. For instance, the British Empire controlled India and influenced China without always sending settlers. These imperial relationships shaped trade routes, infrastructure, and cultural connections that still affect politics today. Independence movements emerged in the 20th century as colonized and controlled regions began demanding sovereignty and self-rule. Many countries in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean gained independence after World War II. These movements often redrew political boundaries and created new states. For example, India and Pakistan became independent from British control in 1947, forming separate states based on religion and cultural identity. Devolution is the process by which central governments give more power to regional governments, often along national or ethnic lines. This can lead to greater autonomy or even independence. For example, Scotland has its own parliament and some control over laws, even though it remains part of the United Kingdom. In Spain, regions like Catalonia and the Basque Country have pushed for greater autonomy or full independence due to strong regional identities. That brings us to the end of topic 4.2. If you're following along with the study guide, check your answers for this section using the answer key before moving on. For this lesson's free response question set, you'll get to practice an exam-style question where you can interpret geographic data about this topic. And when you're ready, we'll move on to topic 4.3. In this lesson, we will examine how political power is tied to geography. Governments and groups often seek to control land, people, and resources. First, we'll look at geographic expressions of political power. Then we'll explore the concept of territoriality, which explains why people feel connected to land. Let's start with geographic expressions of political power. 3 important aspects that geographers study are neocolonialism, shatterbelts, and choke points. Let's look at each one. Neocolonialism refers to the use of economic, political, or cultural pressure to control or influence other countries, especially former colonies. Even though direct colonial rule has ended in many places, some powerful countries still control weaker ones through trade deals, foreign aid, or debt. For example, many African countries rely on foreign companies for infrastructure or resources, leading to unequal relationships. Neocolonialism limits the independence of weaker countries and keeps global power imbalanced. Shatterbelts are regions that are deeply divided by conflict because they're caught between the interests of powerful states. These areas are politically unstable and often experience violence or shifting alliances. For example, Eastern Europe during the Cold War was a shatterbelt between the Western powers, like the United States and NATO, and the Eastern Bloc, led by the Soviet Union. More recently, the Middle East has become a shatterbelt due to the overlapping influence of global powers and regional tensions. Choke points are narrow geographic areas, like straits or canals, that are strategically important for trade and military power. Because so much shipping passes through these points, Whoever controls them gains enormous power. Examples include the Strait of Hormuz, which connects the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea, and the Suez Canal, which connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. Control over these routes allows countries to influence global oil supplies and military access. Now let's look at territoriality. Territoriality is the connection of people, their culture, and their economy to the land. It is the reason why borders matter, why people fight over territory, and why control of land is so important in politics. There are two main reasons why territoriality matters: cultural identity and economic interest. Let's explore each one. Cultural identity often ties people to specific regions. Ethnic groups may see a certain area as their homeland, even if they don't currently control it. For example, the Jewish connection to Israel or the Kurdish claim to parts of Iraq, Syria, and Turkey are based on long-standing cultural and historical ties to land. Economic interest is another reason territoriality matters. Land holds value because of its natural resources, transportation routes, or strategic location. Countries protect farmland, coastlines, oil fields, and mining areas because these assets support their economies. In the South China Sea, for example, several countries claim overlapping areas rich in fish, oil, and gas, which leads to political disputes. Territoriality helps explain why conflicts over land happen, why borders are defended, and why control over space is so central to politics. It shows how land is not just physical, it is also cultural, symbolic, and strategic. That brings us to the end of Topic 4.3. If you're following along with the study guide, check your answers for this section using the answer key before moving on. And when you're ready, we'll move on to Topic 4.4. In this lesson, we will explore how political boundaries are defined and classified. We'll study 6 major types of boundaries: relic boundaries, superimposed boundaries, subsequent boundaries, antecedent boundaries, geometric boundaries, and consequent boundaries. Each type of boundary tells a different story about how people, governments, and history have shaped the land. If you're following along with the study guide, there's a table provided for this lesson where you can enter the definitions and examples for each type of boundary. Try to fill it out as you watch over the next few minutes. Then, test yourself on the follow-up questions I've provided beneath the table. In most years, one or more of the MCQs test students on boundary types, so it's well worth your time. A relic boundary is a boundary that no longer functions as a dividing line, but still leaves a visible mark on the landscape. It remains as a cultural or historical feature. One famous example is the Berlin Wall, which once divided East and West Berlin. Even though the wall was torn down in 1989, its path is still marked in the city, and the cultural divide it created can still be felt. A superimposed boundary is a boundary that is placed on an area by an outside power, often ignoring existing cultural or ethnic divisions. These boundaries are common in places that were colonized. For example, the boundaries of many African countries were drawn by European powers during the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, without considering tribal or linguistic groups. These artificial borders have led to lasting conflict and division. A subsequent boundary is created after a region is already settled, and it often reflects cultural, ethnic, or social divisions. These boundaries evolve over time as people interact and claim space. For example, the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland reflects differences in religion and political identity that developed over centuries. An antecedent boundary is the opposite of a subsequent boundary. Subsequent boundaries are drawn after prolonged settlement and political dispute over territories. But antecedent boundaries are drawn before a large population settles in the area. Because antecedent boundaries are drawn early, they usually avoid disputes over cultural or ethnic divisions. For instance, the boundary between the United States and Canada along the 49th parallel was established before much of the land was settled by colonizers. This helped to prevent significant wars between the British Dominion of Canada in the north and the independent Republic of the United States in the south. Of course, the idea that this boundary is antecedent reflects the Western colonialist worldview. It failed to acknowledge that there were indigenous people living on the land prior to Western colonization, and many indigenous nations that still exist today remain split in two by the border between the United States and Canada. A geometric boundary is a boundary that follows a straight line or specific coordinate, such as a line of latitude or longitude. These boundaries are not based on natural or cultural features. While geometric boundaries are easy to draw and map, they can cut through groups or landscapes, leading to future disputes. I just stated that the border between the United States and Canada is an antecedent boundary, but it's also a geometric one. You can see on this image that it is a long, straight line. This is because it follows the 49th parallel. A consequent boundary is drawn to match cultural divisions, such as language, religion, or ethnicity. These boundaries try to respect the identities of the people living in an area. For example, the boundary between India and Pakistan, created in 1947, was drawn largely based on religious differences between Hindus and Muslims. Remember, a boundary can fit into one or more of these categories, so be careful to think about all possible categories before writing down your answer in the exam. Okay, that's it for types of boundaries. If you're following along with the study guide, check your answers for the table and the follow-up questions using the answer key before moving on, and do the free response questions if you're using the FRQ Mastery Playbook. And when you're ready, we'll move on to topic 4.5. In this lesson, we will examine how political boundaries function in the modern world. First, we'll explore how boundaries are created and managed. Second, we'll discuss why some boundaries reflect culture or economics, while others do not. Third, we'll examine the effects of political boundaries on people and nations. Fourth, we'll look at the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which defines rights and responsibilities in regard to maritime boundaries. Let's start with how boundaries are created and managed. For AP Human Geography, you need to know the following 4 steps used to establish a boundary: definition, delimitation, demarcation, and administration. This section of the lesson also requires that you know about how boundaries can still be contested even after they're created. Let's go through each of these points in order. The first step is definition. A boundary is defined when countries or regions agree, usually through a legal document, on where the line should go. This step creates a written description of the boundary, often in a treaty. The second step is delimitation, which is when the agreed-upon boundary is drawn on a map. This makes the legal description visible and helps governments plan and enforce it. The third step is demarcation, which is when the boundary is marked on the landscape. This might involve building a fence, placing boundary markers, or even constructing a wall. Not all boundaries are physically demarcated, but when they are, it helps make the division clear on the ground. The fourth and final step is administration. This is how the boundary is managed on a daily basis. Governments monitor who crosses it, enforce border laws, and maintain infrastructure like checkpoints and surveillance. But even when boundaries are created through all 4 steps, they are often contested. Countries may disagree about the exact location of a border or fight over nearby resources. For example, the boundary between India and China in the Himalayas is still disputed despite multiple rounds of negotiation. Now let's move on to our second concept in this lesson. This is all about why political boundaries are drawn the way they are. We'll look at 3 ways boundaries are drawn: to reflect cultural divisions, to reflect economic differences, or to follow outside political decisions. Let's begin with cultural boundaries. These are drawn based on traits like language, religion, or ethnicity. When a boundary separates groups with different identities, it can reduce conflict by giving each group space to govern itself. For example, in the previous lesson, we saw how the consequent boundary between India and Pakistan was drawn along religious lines. Next are economic boundaries, which divide areas based on differences in wealth, development, or opportunity. For example, the US-Mexico border separates 2 countries with different economic systems. This difference causes high levels of migration and debate over trade, labor, and security. Finally, there are boundaries created by external political decisions, often with no regard for the people living there. For this lesson, the AP Human Geography curriculum gives one explicit example, so it might be covered in the exam. This example is the Berlin Conference of 1884. We also discussed the Berlin Conference in the previous lesson. During this conference, European powers divided up Africa into colonies. These superimposed boundaries ignored tribal and cultural lines, and the result was long-term conflict and weak national unity in many African countries. Okay, our third concept for this lesson is the effects of political boundaries. Boundaries shape more than territory. They shape how people see themselves and how countries interact. In this section, we'll examine three key effects: how land boundaries shape identity, how maritime boundaries affect resources, and how boundary clarity influences cooperation or conflict. Let's begin with land boundaries and identity. When countries have clearly drawn and stable land borders, they help people develop a sense of national identity. To go back to the India and Pakistan example, the border between these two nations restricts the flow of people between the two countries and reinforces their ethnic and religious differences. That boundary helps maintain their national differences and limits contact. In contrast, the open borders between countries in the European Union allow people to travel freely, encouraging a shared European identity. Next, we turn to maritime boundaries and resource control. Oceans hold valuable resources like fish, oil, and natural gas. Boundaries in the water determine who can access these. One key example is the South China Sea, where multiple countries claim overlapping maritime zones because of the resources there. These disputes often lead to tension and even military activity. Next, let's look at how boundaries affect cooperation and conflict. Essentially, when countries agree on their boundaries, they are more likely to cooperate through trade, transportation, and tourism. But when boundaries are disputed, conflict is more likely. The difference between the peaceful border between Canada and the US and the tense border between Israel and Palestine shows how much boundary clarity can affect relationships. The fourth thing we need to cover in this lesson is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. This is an international agreement designed to manage boundaries on the ocean. It defines the rights and responsibilities of nation-states in relation to three zones. These zones are based on distance from a country's shore. They are international waters, territorial seas, and exclusive economic zones. Let's explore each one. International waters, also called the high seas, lie beyond any country's national jurisdiction. The Convention on the Law of the Sea says that no country owns these waters. All nations have equal rights to use them for peaceful purposes like shipping, fishing, and scientific research. However, countries must respect the freedom of other states and avoid harmful practices like pollution or piracy. Next, each coastal country has control over a territorial sea that stretches up to 12 nautical miles from its coastline. In this zone, the country has full sovereignty, similar to its land territory. It controls the water, seafloor, airspace above, and natural resources. Still, the Convention on the Law of the Sea requires that foreign ships be allowed innocent passage, meaning they can travel through without causing harm or disruption. Finally, an exclusive economic zone stretches 200 nautical miles from a country's coast. Within this area, the coastal state does not own the waters, but it does have special rights to explore, manage, and use natural resources, especially for fishing, oil, and gas. Other nations can pass through or fly over the exclusive economic zone, but they cannot exploit its resources without permission. Okay, that's it for this lesson. If you're following along with the study guide, check your answers for this section using the answer key before moving on. And when you're ready, we'll move on to Topic 4.6. Topic 4.6 pivots to internal boundaries within countries, especially voting districts. These boundaries exist inside a country and are used to organize how people vote and how governments represent their citizens. We will study this topic in three parts. First, we'll look at voting districts. Second, we'll examine the process of redistricting, including why it happens and how it shifts political power. Finally, we'll look closely at gerrymandering and how it affects elections. To begin, we need to understand what voting districts are and why they exist. A voting district is a geographic area where voters choose a representative. In most democratic systems, each district selects one person to represent them in a government body, such as a city council, state legislature, or national parliament. These districts are created to make sure people in different areas have a voice in government. At the local level, cities and towns may be divided into small voting districts called wards or precincts. At the state level, states are divided into districts for electing state lawmakers. And at the national level, states are divided into congressional districts, each of which elects a member to the House of Representatives. In each case, the goal is to organize voters into manageable groups so they can choose leaders fairly and efficiently. Next, let's explore redistricting, the process of redrawing voting district boundaries. There are two key ideas to understand here: why redistricting happens and how it changes political power. Redistricting happens to keep voting districts equal in population. As people move, cities grow, and populations shift, voting districts can become unbalanced. One district might have twice as many people as another, which would make votes in the smaller district more powerful. To prevent this, governments redraw district boundaries, usually every 10 years after a population census, to make sure each district has roughly the same number of people. But redistricting does more than balance population. It can also shift political power. Depending on how the lines are drawn, one political party might gain more seats than another. Even small changes to district boundaries can affect election results for years to come. To more clearly understand this phenomenon, we need to look at a concept called gerrymandering, which is the practice of redrawing voting districts to give one political party an unfair advantage. Here we'll explore how gerrymandering works, how it affects elections, and how it operates at multiple scales. First, let's explain what gerrymandering is and how it works. Gerrymandering is when politicians use redistricting to shape districts in a way that favors their party. This can involve drawing strange or unnatural shapes to include or exclude certain voters. Two common techniques are cracking and packing. Cracking means spreading opposing voters across many districts so they don't form a majority anywhere. Packing means putting as many opposing voters as possible into one district so their influence is limited to that area. Gerrymandering can significantly affect elections. It can allow a party to win more seats than they would fairly earn based on total votes. For example, a party might win only 45% of the popular vote but still take 60% of the seats if the districts are drawn in their favor. This undermines the idea of equal representation and can make people feel like their votes don't count. Gerrymandering happens at multiple scales. It's not just a national issue. Gerrymandering can affect local school boards, state legislatures, and city councils, especially in areas where one political group controls the redistricting process. At any level, gerrymandering weakens democracy by allowing those in power to choose their voters instead of letting voters choose their leaders. Okay, that's it for this lesson. If you're following along with the study guide, check your answers for this section using the answer key before moving on. And when you're ready, we'll move on to topic 4.7. In this lesson, we will examine the two major forms of governance used by states around the world. These are called unitary states and federal states, and they describe how political power is organized within a country. A unitary state is a system of government where all legal power is held by a central authority. Regional or local governments may exist, but they only have powers the central government chooses to give them. Examples of unitary states include the United Kingdom, France, and Japan. In each of these, the central government controls major policies like education, transportation, and national defense, although some powers may be delegated locally. Unitary systems often lead to faster decision-making because fewer levels of government are involved. However, they can also cause tension if local groups feel ignored by national leaders, especially in diverse or large countries. Now let's look at federal states. A federal state is a system where power is shared between a central government and smaller political units like states or provinces. Each level of government has its own responsibilities protected by a constitution. For example, the federal government may control foreign policy, while states manage education or transportation. Examples of federal states include the United States, Canada, and Australia. In these countries, individual states or provinces have their own laws, leaders, and policies alongside national laws. Federal systems can better address local needs and allow for more political diversity. However, they can also create confusion or conflict when different levels of government disagree or pass conflicting laws. That's it for topic 4.7. If you're following along with the study guide, check your answers for this section using the answer key before moving on. And when you're ready, we'll move on to topic 4.8. In this lesson, we will look at the concept of devolution. This occurs when countries lose power or break apart, causing the transfer of power from a central government to smaller regions or groups. It can lead to greater local autonomy, or to complete separation and the formation of new countries. The factors that can lead to the devolution of states include physical geography, ethnic separatism, ethnic cleansing, terrorism, economic and social problems, and irredentism. Physical geography can lead to devolution when natural features like mountains, deserts, or large bodies of water separate groups of people. These barriers make communication and travel harder, which can lead regions to feel isolated and develop their own identity. For example, the Himalayas separate parts of northern India from the rest of the country, which contributes to tension in Kashmir, where some groups want independence or union with Pakistan. Ethnic separatism happens when a distinct ethnic group within a country wants to break away to form its own country or gain more autonomy. These groups usually have their own language, culture, or religion that differs from the majority. In Spain, for example, the Basques and Catalans each have strong identities and have pushed for independence at different times. Catalonia even held a controversial independence vote in 2017. Ethnic cleansing refers to efforts to remove or eliminate a specific ethnic group from a region, often through forced migration, violence, or genocide. This extreme action can split a country and cause lasting division. During the breakup of Yugoslavia in the 1990s, ethnic cleansing occurred as different groups fought for control. These acts shattered the unity of the former state and led to the creation of new countries. Terrorism can lead to devolution when violent groups use attacks to push for independence or greater regional power. These groups often claim to represent a specific ethnic or religious population. In the United Kingdom, the Irish Republican Army used terrorism for decades in an effort to unite Northern Ireland with the Republic of Ireland. While peace agreements have reduced violence, the long conflict showed how terrorism can destabilize countries and push governments to give regions more autonomy to reduce tensions. When one region of a country feels left out economically or socially, it may demand more control over its own affairs. This kind of inequality can fuel resentment and lead to devolution. For example, northern Italy has a wealthier economy than the southern part, and some political groups in the north have pushed for more regional control of taxes and spending. Irredentism happens when a group or country claims land in another country because they believe it belongs to them, often due to shared ethnicity or history. This can pull parts of a country toward a neighboring nation, weakening national unity. A famous example is Russia's claim to Crimea, which was part of Ukraine but has many Russian-speaking people. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea, arguing it was protecting its people and territory. This led to ongoing conflict and shows how irredentism can break apart existing states. Okay, that's it for devolution. You're going to need to remember these 6 concepts and how they can cause devolution. They may come up in the exam. If you're following along with the study guide, I provided a table and interactive questions for you to fill out to help reinforce these terms in your memory. Before moving on, check your answers to those questions and compare your table to the completed sample table in the answer key. And then we'll start with topic 4.9. State sovereignty is a government's ability to control its own territory and make decisions independently. In this lesson, we will examine challenges to state sovereignty in today's world. The 3 challenges you need to know about for AP Human Geography are devolution, communication technologies, and supranationalism, which we'll break down into 2 parts: purpose and challenges. The first challenge to sovereignty is devolution, which you should know about from the previous lesson. So we'll be quick here. Devolution refers to the transfer of power from the state to local or regional groups. It tends to occur when there is conflict between subgroups within a state. It is a threat to state sovereignty because it can cause a state to disintegrate from within. The second major challenge to sovereignty comes from communication technology, which spreads ideas quickly and gives people new tools to challenge or resist central authority. In this section, we will look at 3 ways communication technology challenges state sovereignty. These are by promoting devolution, by supporting democratization, and by strengthening supranationalism. The first impact of communication technologies is potential devolution. When people in distant or marginalized regions have access to the internet and social media, they can share information, organize protests, and demand more autonomy. So, communication technologies can help marginalized groups to bring about the devolution of states, and therefore threaten state sovereignty. The second potential impact of communication technology is democratization. Technology allows people to learn about political systems, connect with reform movements, and push for greater rights. In countries with strict or authoritarian governments, communication tools can help citizens organize opposition. The Arab Spring, which began in 2010, was largely fueled by social media as people across the Middle East demanded democratic reforms. This brought about the end of the state sovereignty of nations like Libya, which brought down their dictator Muammar Gaddafi. The third potential impact of communication technology is supranationalism. Supranationalism means countries joining together in groups to work on common goals. Communication technologies facilitate this process of supranationalism because they connect citizens of the world together and help them to unite in common goals. For the rest of this lesson, we'll dig into this concept of supranationalism, both its purpose and challenges. Examples of major supranational organizations include the United Nations, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, European Union, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, Arctic Council, and African Union. When countries join these groups, they agree to share some of their sovereignty in exchange for benefits like security, economic growth, or global influence. There are 3 main purposes of supranational cooperation: addressing transnational and environmental issues, creating economies of scale and trade agreements, and forming military alliances. The first purpose is solving transnational and environmental issues. Many modern problems like climate change, pandemics, or refugee crises do not stop at national borders. Countries need to work together to find solutions. For example, international agreements like the Paris Climate Accord aim to reduce global emissions, but by signing on, countries agree to follow shared rules that limit some of their own decision-making power. The second purpose is creating economies of scale and trade agreements. When countries form trade blocs or economic unions, they gain access to larger markets, shared resources, and joint infrastructure. The European Union is an example of a group where members trade freely and follow common economic policies. The third purpose is building military alliances. Countries join alliances like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to protect themselves against threats, but this also means sharing military decisions with other countries. If one member is attacked, all others are expected to respond. While supranationalism can help solve significant geopolitical problems, it can also challenge state sovereignty. In this section, we'll explore 2 key challenges to state sovereignty: political constraints and economic constraints. The first challenge is the political limitations placed by supranational groups. Membership in organizations like the United Nations means agreeing to follow rules on human rights, peacekeeping, and conflict resolution. Countries that violate these rules may face international pressure, sanctions, or even intervention, which limits their political freedom. The second challenge is economic limitations placed by supranational groups. Economic unions, such as the EU or trade groups like ASEAN, set regulations that member states must follow on taxes, tariffs, and product standards. These rules make trade easier, but reduce each country's control over its own economic policies. Okay, that brings us to the end of Topic 4.9. If you're following along with the study guide, check your answers for this section, using the answer key before moving on. And when you're ready, we'll move on to Topic 4.10. In this lesson, we will examine 2 powerful forces that affect the unity of a state: centrifugal forces and centripetal forces. Centrifugal forces divide people. Centripetal forces bring people together. We touched on these in Topic 3.3 when discussing culture, but in this lesson, our focus is on dividing and uniting states rather than cultures. You'll also notice many of the examples in this lesson have been presented earlier in this unit. But to make sure we thoroughly review the course and prepare you for the exam, we're strictly following the AP Human Geography curriculum, step by step, and it does repeat itself at times. I'll try to be quick when going over repeated examples. First, we'll explore 4 consequences of centrifugal forces, including failed states, uneven development, stateless nations, and ethnic nationalist movements. Then we'll explore 3 consequences of centripetal forces, including ethno-nationalism, more equitable infrastructure development, and increased cultural cohesion. Let's start with the consequences and outcomes of centrifugal forces, which are the forces that would divide a state. The first consequence is the emergence of failed states. A failed state is a country where the government is no longer able to maintain order, enforce laws, or provide basic services. Centrifugal forces like civil war, widespread corruption, or ethnic conflict can cause a state to lose control over parts of its territory. A well-known example is Somalia, where the central government has struggled to maintain authority across the country for decades. The second consequence is uneven development. When certain regions of a country are much wealthier or more developed than others, it creates resentment and weakens national unity. The poorer areas may feel neglected, while the richer areas may resist sharing resources. This economic divide is a common centrifugal force that can lead to demands for regional autonomy or independence. The third consequence is the existence of stateless nations. A stateless nation is a group of people with a strong ethnic or cultural identity, but no independent state of their own. When these groups live within a larger country that does not represent them, they may feel alienated or oppressed. The Kurds, who are spread across Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran, are a major example. Their lack of a state fuels ongoing tension and separatist movements. The fourth consequence is the rise of ethnic nationalist movements. These movements form when an ethnic group wants to form its own country or gain more political power. They often arise in response to perceived discrimination or cultural suppression. For example, the Catalan independence movement in Spain is driven by the belief that Catalonia should be a separate nation because of its unique language and culture. Now let's look at centripetal forces, which unify people and strengthen a state. The first consequence is ethno-nationalism. While some forms of ethno-nationalism can be divisive, it can also serve as a centripetal force when people rally around a shared culture, language, or heritage in support of the state. In Japan, a strong sense of cultural identity has helped maintain political stability and loyalty to the state. The second consequence is equitable infrastructure development. When governments invest in roads, schools, and services in all regions, not just the wealthy ones, it promotes a sense of fairness. People are more likely to support the state when they see that resources are shared. The third consequence is increased cultural cohesion. Governments can promote unity by supporting national holidays, official languages, shared symbols, and inclusive education. These efforts help people from different backgrounds feel like part of a single national community. And with that, we've come to the end of this lesson. If you're following along with the study guide, check your answers for this section using the answer key before moving on. That also brings us to the end of Unit 4, so it's time to dive right into Unit 5.